I found it tucked inside the bell of a rusted Victor phonograph horn, a yellowed envelope no thicker than a razor blade, sealed with a dab of wax so old it crumbled under my thumbnail. Inside was our original partnership agreement, notarized and signed, with my brother's 45% stake printed in smudged typewriter ink, and a handwritten note from my late husband on the back that read, "Grace, if you're reading this, Gerald has shown his colors. This document is your shield. Do not trust him, save yourself." That single sheet of paper would not only unwind a $500,000 forgery and a museum sale built on fraud, it would eventually land my brother in my workshop day after day, polishing brass horns in a shirt that says "Cranked Up Lies," while every restoration tag we print carries the very docket number that proved his crime. This is exactly how it happened. I was 47 years old, a former union machinist with micrometers in my muscle memory and hands that could feel a 10,000th of an inch of runout on a spindle. My husband Daniel and I had spent every Sunday for 15 years hunched over a workbench in our garage, bringing acoustic phonographs back from the dead, machines that hadn't sung since before the First World War. He was a broadcast engineer by trade, a man who could read a wax cylinder groove like a seismograph, tracing the hills and valleys of a century-old recording with a jeweler's loop and a steady finger, murmuring about the horn players who had stood in front of a recording bell in 1904 and blown their souls into a spinning drum of brown wax. We shared a quiet obsession with older technologies, the kind that stored music in physical undulations rather than cold digital zeros and ones, and our garage smelled of shellac, cutting oil, and the faintly sweet, slightly rancid scent of old grease from spring barrels that had not been wound since the Great Depression. We had restored an Edison Home Model D that sang like a parlor angel, a Columbia BQ with a nickel-plated crane that gleamed under the overhead fluorescent, and once, memorably, a rare 1898 Berliner gramophone with a hand-cranked turntable, and a vulcanite reproducer that Daniel rebuilt by casting new hard rubber in a mold he machined from a block of aluminum on his lathe. That machine had come to us in a steamer trunk from an estate in Pittsburgh, its spring broken, its reproducer diaphragm petrified, and we worked on it in companionable silence for 6 months, stopping only to brew coffee and play old Caruso discs on the Victor we kept permanently queued beside the drill press. When the Berliner finally played a scratched recording of Sousa's Washington Post March, Daniel took my hand and we danced a clumsy two-step between the bench and the parts washer, and I remember thinking that this was the truest thing I had ever built, a partnership that hummed as smoothly as a freshly lapped governor gear. Daniel was not a man who made grand pronouncements, but he paid attention to the world in a way that I have only ever seen in people who tune circuits by ear. He noticed the way my shoulders tightened when my brother Gerald called to talk about investment opportunities, the way the phone receiver seemed to grow heavier in my hand as Gerald spun monologues about tax shelters and passive income streams and a timeshare in Belize that just needed a few final signatures. Daniel never criticized him outright, not at first, but he began saving documents in a fireproof safe in the corner of the workshop, a squat grey Sentry box with a combination lock that he changed every 6 months and never wrote down. He told me once, with a lightness that didn't quite reach his eyes, "Your brother never met a dollar he didn't want to adopt." I shrugged because family was family, and Gerald was my mother's golden child, the one who had gotten the dimples and the charm and the knack for making people feel special for the 5 minutes he was shaking their hand. I should have listened to everything Daniel was trying to tell me. A brain aneurysm took Daniel in his sleep 3 days before our anniversary. I woke up to a silence so dense I thought it would crack my ribs, a cold coffee cup beside his side of the bed where he'd set it the night before, and a stillness in the house that felt like the moment after a phonograph needle lifts off a record, but before the mechanism clicks off. The life insurance payout was $109,000, a check that arrived in a cream envelope with a condolence card from the provider, and I deposited it while still wearing the black dress from the funeral, operating on autopilot through a world that had suddenly lost all its color. Gerald flew in from Scottsdale wearing a suit that cost more than Daniel's burial plot, charcoal with a subtle windowpane check, and a pocket square folded into a presidential peak that he had almost certainly practiced in a hotel mirror. He had our mother's dimples and a salesman's instinct for reading a room, which meant he spent the reception at the community hall cornering mourners and handing out business cards for a consulting firm that existed mostly on paper, a one-page website and a mailbox at a strip mall shipping store. His wife Patricia stood at his elbow in a charcoal dress, scrolling Zillow for the valuation of my house, while pretending to blot her eyes with a tissue she never quite touched to her dry cheeks. Patricia was a former real estate stager who had leveraged Gerald's bluster into a series of strategic branding ventures, each of which failed after about 18 months, leaving behind a trail of angry vendors and maxed-out business cards. She had a way of appraising objects, including people, by their resale value, and I saw her eyes linger on Daniel's vintage audio equipment with the same flat calculation she'd used on the silverware at my wedding. Within 24 hours of the burial, Gerald and Patricia let themselves into my kitchen with a spare key I never gave them. I was still in the clothes I'd worn the day before, my hair unwashed, my mind moving through molasses, and I didn't register the audacity of it until Gerald was already seated at the head of my dining table with a 3-ring leather folio that smelled of fresh dye and legal pads. He talked about consolidating assets and protecting me from predatory lenders, his voice thick with the fake empathy of a televangelist on a late-night broadcast, the kind who promises salvation just as soon as you fill out the pledge card. Patricia opened my refrigerator, sighed at the leftovers, and announced that I would be moving into their guest house for my own good. "You can't rattle around this place alone, honey," she said, as though my house were a crypt, and she was doing me the kindness of exhuming me. Gerald began sorting my mail into piles he labelled urgent, estate, and trash, his pen making sharp little ticks on the envelopes of bills and account statements. He pointed at a stack of Daniel's old audio journals, those marbled composition notebooks filled with his handwritten notes on stylus geometry and spring torque calculations, and told me to let him handle the clutter. When he reached for a dented phonograph horn leaning against the bookcase, he laughed a short, contemptuous bark. "Junk," he said. "I'll toss it with the rest of the scrap." He hefted it by its narrow throat, flaking rust onto the floor, and set it by the back door next to a bag of aluminum cans that had been waiting for a recycling run since Daniel was alive. I didn't react, because my grief had calcified into a kind of fog that made everything feel distant and slow, but some small, mechanical part of my brain filed the moment away. I waited until they left to inventory the silverware and every piece of audio equipment, and then I retrieved that horn. It was a 16-inch Morning Glory reproducer from a 1906 Victor Type E, its bell flaring outward in a smooth exponential curve that Victor's engineers had calculated to suppress standing waves, its throat perforated with pinhole rust, its flange scratched from a century of careless handling. I carried it into the workshop, locked the door, and set it on the bench under the circle of light from the articulating lamp Daniel had salvaged from a defunct dentist's office. The horn was cold in my hands, heavy with history, and I handled it with the same reverence I'd use on a patient in a triage unit. I unscrewed the elbow joint with a strap wrench I'd made from an old fan belt and a section of pipe handle, the rubber gripping the brass without marring it, and when the threads released with a faint screech of corroded metal, I peered inside the throat with a penlight. Nothing. But when I shook the horn, I heard a faint rattle deep inside, something sliding against the inner curve. I fished in with a pair of surgical forceps from Daniel's toolkit, the tips padded with a strip of heat-shrink tubing so they wouldn't scratch, and after 4 careful attempts I caught the edge of something and slid out a manila envelope the size of a playing card, brittle with age and speckled with rust dust. The wax seal flaked away at my touch. Inside were 6 sheets of onion skin paper, typed and notarized, the ink slightly faded but perfectly legible. The document detailed a partnership between Grace Calloway and Gerald Calloway, dated 3 years earlier, the night after Daniel and I had first discussed turning our hobby into a real business. Daniel must have drawn it up as a precaution after one of Gerald's investment phone calls, his lawyer's eye for contingency planning catching a future I couldn't yet see. I had forgotten it existed. Gerald's signature was on the 3rd page, his 45% stake spelled out in clear language, alongside a clause I had insisted on, a sentimental addition I'd thought Gerald had signed without reading. Gerald Calloway shall organize and host Sunday afternoon concerts of restored recordings for the benefit of Grace Calloway's descendants in perpetuity, at no cost or fee. I had wanted my grandkids to hear what music sounded like before compression destroyed its soul, to hear Caruso's tenor vibrating in real air through a Morning Glory horn, and Gerald had apparently skimmed right past it, his attention fixed on the percentage. On the final sheet, written in Daniel's steady architectural capitals, the letters formed with the same precision he used to label calibration discs, was the warning. Beneath it, tucked into a folded tissue and taped to the back of the envelope, was something I hadn't expected, a micro-cassette tape the size of a postage stamp in a tiny plastic case that rattled when I turned it over. I didn't have a player, but I recognized Daniel's handwriting on a label. Grace, listen when you can. I set it aside, my heart hammering. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the people who try to bury you often end up digging their own graves. I did not confront Gerald. I did not tell Patricia what I had found. Instead, I played the role of the foggy widow, a woman too grief-stricken to balance her own checkbook, and I let them underestimate me with the same quiet hunger that had once allowed me to outwork every man on the union floor by pretending not to notice they'd given me the hardest jobs. When Gerald sat me down 3 days later and slid a durable power of attorney across the dining room table, a document typed in 12-point Palatino with lines for my signature at the bottom, I squinted at the text like I needed reading glasses I didn't own, hummed a half-remembered hymn under my breath, and set my pen down on the wrong line, missing the signature block by 2 inches. I just need a little more time, I whispered, letting my voice quaver. Everything's so fuzzy. I keep seeing his face in the toaster. Patricia patted my hand with a cool, dry palm and said we'd revisit it soon, her eyes flicking to Gerald with an impatience she didn't bother to hide. They moved me into their guest house that weekend, a converted pool cabana with a Murphy bed that squealed when I lowered it, a mini-fridge stocked with expired yogurt, and a single window that looked out onto the pump housing of the swimming pool heater. It smelled of chlorine and old carpet glue, and the door had a lock on their side, not mine, a detail I noted with the cold focus of a machinist checking a blueprint. I let them believe they were doing me a favor. I brought the phonograph horn with me, wrapped in a quilt, and told them it was a sentimental keepsake. Gerald smirked and said, "It's good to have a hobby." The first month was pure observation. I kept a mental ledger of every financial red flag that passed through that house, categorizing them like a quality control log at the machine shop. Time, date, nature of deviation. Gerald spent his mornings on the phone in his home office, the door cracked open just enough for me to hear the panic in his voice when a creditor called, his sales patter collapsing into stammered promises about cash flow and pending receivables. He had leveraged something, clearly, and the interest was eating him alive. Patricia took a job as a strategic branding consultant for a local jewelry boutique, a title that meant she posted filtered photographs of diamond bracelets on Instagram, while the boutique's actual books hemorrhaged cash into a hole so deep I could hear the echo. I saw her Venmo notifications pop up on her iPad when she left it open on the kitchen island, small desperate transfers from an account labeled G&G Ventures to a woman named Colleen with the note, last extension PLS. I started digging in the recycling bin, a habit born of old-school machine shop inventory tracking, and within 2 weeks I had pulled out credit card offers addressed to me that I had never applied for, with credit limits of $20,000 each, all listing Gerald's home address as my primary residence. The date on the applications was 11 days after Daniel's funeral. Gerald had been shopping for debt in my name before the flowers had even wilted. Then came the museum phone call. I was trimming dead fronds from the poolside palm with a pair of shears I'd sharpened myself, listening to the careful snip of each fibrous leaf, when I heard Gerald's voice spike through the open office window, high and tight with a greed so pure it could cut glass. 520,000, he said, then a long pause while someone on the other end spoke. Yes, the entire collection, all 96 cylinders and the 6 machines, fully restored, provenance documented. I have the owner's logbooks right here. Every stylus regrind, every spring retempering, it's all documented, museum grade. He hung up, paced for 10 minutes so hard I could feel the vibration through the concrete slab, and then called Patricia in a voice so giddy I felt my stomach drop through the lawn chair. "The Smithsonian affiliate wants it," he said. "The Rosenthal Music Museum. They're sending an appraiser next Tuesday." Patricia's voice a delighted hiss, and Grace, Gerald's laugh short and flat. Grace is about to become very, very cooperative. Here is where the heist mechanics truly start. Gerald and I had spent the previous 18 months building that collection together with the insurance payout. I had leased a small commercial unit on the industrial edge of town, a former die-casting shop with a concrete floor that didn't mind the weight of heavy machinery, excellent ventilation that pulled shellac fumes out through a roof stack, and a roll-up door wide enough to back a panel truck full of Bergman cabinets right up to the workbench. Gerald had contributed nothing but his sales patter and a used Dell laptop with a cracked hinge, but he had notarized the partnership agreement that Daniel drafted, and he had shown up for Sunday concerts at my granddaughter Alina's elementary school, playing Bessie Smith recordings through a rebuilt exhibition reproducer, while kids colored pictures of gramophones, and their teacher tried to explain the concept of acoustic recording. The collection was legitimately spectacular, the product of every hour I could spare from my machining job, and every nugget of expertise Daniel had left behind in his notebooks. I had a pristine 1908 Edison Fireside Model A, its signet horn blooming like a brass tulip, its mandrel bearing so true I had aligned it to within 0.02 of an inch using a dial indicator, and a process of iterative lapping that took 3 evenings. An Ambarola 1A with the mahogany lid still glossy, its spring motor so smoothly retempered that you could wind it with 2 fingers and hear each tick of the pawl like a heartbeat. A rare Pathé Actuel cylinder of Caruso's earliest recordings, the translucent blue celluloid unwrapped from a private vault in Naples, its surface so pristine that under the microscope the groove looked like a freshly ploughed field, and 96 brown wax cylinders I had painstakingly disinfected with a UV wand I'd built from an old aquarium light, shaved on a mandrel lathe to remove 1/1000 of an inch of oxidized surface, and re-recorded from Daniel's archive of pre-1920 session masters, a process that required me to reverse-engineer the recording equalization curve Edison's engineers had used in 1908, and build a passive filter network from hand-wound inductors and polystyrene capacitors. Every machine had been gone over with a 10,000th dial indicator to true the mandrel, every stylus reground to a 0.004-inch spherical tip under a stereo microscope using a diamond hone and a calibrated protractor, every spring motor retempered in my kitchen oven at 450 degrees for 20 minutes, and then quenched in oil that smelled of burnt walnut. I documented each step in logbooks that ran to 300 pages, spiral-bound notebooks filled with measurement data, torque readings, lubrication intervals, and spectral analysis plots I'd printed from an audio spectrum analyzer Daniel had given me for my 45th birthday. Gerald's contribution had been to post before and after photos on the Talking Machine forum, flirt with museum curators at the annual Phonograph Society convention, and practice his handshake in a mirror until it felt authentic. When the museum appraiser called, he saw a payday that would erase whatever debt was gnawing at his heels. What he didn't know was that I still held the original contract, and that Daniel had hidden more than paper inside that horn. I began my undercover investigation with the same discipline I used to align a pivot bearing. On my 3rd night in the cabana, after I was reasonably sure they'd both gone to sleep, I unpacked the micro-cassette and set about building a player. I had salvaged a broken Olympus pearl recorder from the Goodwill bins years ago, its motor seized, its playback head corroded, and I had kept it in my parts drawers for exactly this kind of puzzle. Over 2 quiet hours with a set of jeweler's screwdrivers, a needle nose oiler filled with watch oil, and a head demagnetizer I'd made from a soldering gun coil, I rebuilt the transport, cleaned the capstan, aligned the head azimuth with a test tape I'd recorded on Daniel's dictation machine years before, and slipped the tiny cassette into the bay. The speaker was short, but I'd wired a set of high-impedance headphones into the audio path. I pressed play and Daniel's voice filled my ears with a clarity that made my breath stop. Grace, I recorded a conversation with Gerald last October when he visited the garage. He didn't know the machine was running. I had it hidden behind the parts washer, the mic gain cranked. Listen. Then Gerald's voice crackled through, smug and confiding, the way he sounded after 2 bourbons at a family barbecue. Look, Danny boy, between us, I've got a foolproof way to liquidate a partnership if it ever gets inconvenient. There's a notary over in Clementville, a woman named Yvonne who did some work for Pat's old staging business. For $500 cash, she'll backdate anything, signature stamps, embossed seals, you name it. If Grace ever gets difficult, I can dissolve the whole thing in an afternoon and she'll never see a dime. It's not personal, it's just business, you understand. The recording was 9 minutes long. By the end of it, I had the entire architecture of his betrayal mapped out, and I knew exactly how he planned to cut me out. A forged dissolution, a backdated notary seal, a sale conducted before I could object, and a token check cut to me as a settlement so small that contesting it would cost more in legal fees than I'd ever recover. He'd bragged about it like he was describing a clever card trick. I catalogued every shred of paper I pulled from the recycling bin, using a light board I cobbled together from a framed LED panel I'd bought at a thrift store for $8, and a sheet of frosted acrylic I'd cut to size with a coping saw. For 12 nights, I sat on the cabana floor with a pair of watchmaker's tweezers, a roll of acid-free document repair tape from my workshop supplies, and a banker's box full of cross-cut strips that looked like linguine made of lies. The office shredder had a distinct nick in its cutting blade, a tiny chip that left a recurring tear pattern on the left edge of every strip, a shape roughly like a truncated triangle that recurred every 17 strips, and I learned to track that pattern like a fingerprint, matching the nick's signature to reassemble sentences. I recreated 9 pages of a document titled Dissolution of Partnership and Bill of Sale in total, taping the strips to sheets of mylar from an old overhead projector transparency pack, and on page 7, I found my own signature, forged with a heavy-handed slant that leaned 22 degrees to the right, while my actual signature, which I had on 100 comparison samples from the original contract, and from old tax returns Daniel had kept, leaned 11 degrees left with a distinctive loop on the capital G that the forgery entirely missed. The notary stamp was a photocopy of a real stamp from a different document, its commission number slightly blurred, and its expiration date showing artifacts of a cut and paste in the pixelation when I examined it under a 10x loop. A genuine embossed seal would have never reproduced that way on a photocopier. It would have shown a 3-dimensional shadow pattern that this one lacked, a dead giveaway to anyone who knew what to look for. I took my reconstructed pages, the original contract, and a digital copy of the microcassette recording to a contact Daniel had given me years earlier, a forensic accountant with the state's Commerce Department named Elena Marchetti. She was a wiry woman in her 60s who wore cardigans over blouses with ink stains on the cuffs, drank black espresso from a thermos she carried like a sidearm, and had once testified in a federal racketeering case where she'd reconstructed 10 years of a fake charity's finances from a dumpster's worth of shredded check stubs. I met her in a coffee shop parking lot at 6:00 a.m., the only car in the lot besides a delivery truck. She spread my evidence across the hood of her Subaru and spent 40 minutes tabbing anomalies with a red pencil, her brows knitting tighter with each page. The dissolution draft lists a sale price of $520,000 to the Rosenthal Music Museum, she said, tapping the figure. The payout to you is listed as $3,900 with a memo that says final record settlement. But here's the thing. That museum is a federally chartered nonprofit. Any transaction over $100,000 requires an IRS Form 8283, a non-cash charitable contribution form if the museum acquired it by donation, and an independent appraisal signed by the legal owner. If Gerald submitted this dissolution with your forged signature and the stolen notary stamp, he committed wire fraud, identity theft, falsification of a federal tax filing, and possibly art fraud under the National Stolen Property Act. The FBI's art crime team handles this kind of thing. I can trigger a compliance review, but we'll need the museum to insist on an in-person verification of identity with all parties physically present at the closing. Can you get me the name of their acquisitions officer? I gave her everything. She agreed to contact the museum and set the trap. The maximum cruelty beat came 3 days later. Gerald had escalated from gentle pressure to outright insistence that I sign a final estate settlement document he said would streamline the museum transaction and protect my interests. He presented it during dinner at their kitchen table, sliding it across the formica beside a plate of cold cuts Patricia had arranged to look like a still life of domestic concern. I recognized the language from my reconstructed drafts. It was the dissolution, repackaged with a cover page in a larger font that called it a property transfer agreement. I told him I needed one more night to review it, using the same distracted, grieving widow voice, and he sighed with a theatrical patience that made Patricia tap her fingernails on her wine glass. That evening, I staged a medical scare. I had learned in the machine shop how to induce a convincing vasovagal response, a sudden drop in blood pressure that causes fainting, by locking my knees and hyperventilating for 30 seconds while standing perfectly still. I'd practiced it twice in the cabana, timing the onset of dizziness and making sure I could fall forward onto my hands to break the impact without injuring myself. Right after dinner in their living room, while Gerald was talking about the tax advantages of the agreement and Patricia was scrolling through a jewelry auction site on her phone, I stood up from the couch, clutched my chest with both hands, and let my eyes roll back as I collapsed onto the woven jute rug with my mouth slack. Patricia shrieked, a high theatrical sound. Gerald, without a single hesitation, without so much as a glance at my face, stepped over my body, his loafer brushing my forearm as he crossed to the coffee table, and pulled my key ring from my purse. He sorted through the keys with the speed of a man who had already memorized which one opened the workshop safe, and he told Patricia, in a voice so cold it crackled, "Wait 2 minutes before calling 911. I need to secure the documents first." If she dies, the estate gets locked up in probate for a year, and we lose the museum window. He left me lying on the floor, my pulse thready and fast from the intentional hyperventilation, my breathing shallow, and I watched Patricia stare after him with a mix of horror and complicity before she crouched beside me and started patting my cheeks with her open palm, a rhythmic, mechanical motion, as if I were a malfunctioning appliance that might restart if she just slapped it hard enough. "Grace, honey, breathe," she said, her voice flat, her eyes darting to the window to track Gerald's figure disappearing into the garage. I waited until I heard Gerald's Lexus pull out of the driveway, heading for my workshop to pilfer the safe's contents, before I came to with a theatrical shudder and asked for a glass of water. Patricia handed it to me with a hand that trembled only slightly, and she didn't meet my eyes. That moment extinguished any residual family loyalty I felt. They would have let me die on that rug for a notary stamp and a drawer full of my own logbooks, and they would have held a memorial with catered hors d'oeuvres and a cash bar. I contacted Elena that night from a burner phone I'd bought at a convenience store 3 towns over, and we set the confrontation in motion. The plan was elegantly simple. The museum's escrow agent, briefed by Elena and the FBI's art crime unit, required an in-person closing at a bank, with all partners physically present to verify identity and sign a notarized transfer of ownership before any funds could be released. The museum had been told that a fraud investigation was underway and that their cooperation was essential to protect the collection's legal provenance. Their acquisitions director, a meticulous woman named Dr. Helen Skiff, agreed to participate without hesitation. I had to admire their professionalism. The closing was scheduled for Friday at 3:00 p.m. in a private conference room at First Mercantile Bank downtown, a granite-and glass building with a lobby that echoed and a security guard who checked our ID with the slow, implacable scrutiny of a TSA agent on a bad day. Gerald and Patricia dressed like they were attending an IPO. He wore a pocket square in a champagne silk puff fold, a tie clip that might have been actual gold, and a silk tie with a repeating gramophone motif that I suspect he had custom-ordered from a website that specialized in novelty neckwear for the historically deluded. Patricia clipped a museum donor pin to her lapel that she had bought on eBay for $12. Its enamel slightly off-color from the real thing, and she carried a patent leather handbag that creaked when she set it down. They drove me to the bank in their leased Lexus, the leather seat smelling of a pine air freshener that couldn't quite cover the scent of Gerald's anxious sweat, and the entire ride Gerald coached me on what to say, his voice a slick, patient drone that reminded me of a hypnotist on a bad community access show. "Just nod when the notary asks if you understand, and sign where I point," he said, patting my knee. "This is a formality. The money's already in escrow, you'll get your little check and we'll all go celebrate at that seafood place Patricia likes. It's a beautiful day, Grace, a new chapter." I sat in the back seat and stared out the window, clutching the worn leather satchel that held my original contract, the reconstructed forgery drafts, the micro-cassette, and a thumb drive containing the digital audio file of Daniel's recording, all arranged in manila folders with tabs I had labeled in my best machinist script. In the conference room, a museum representative, a bank officer, and a notary public were already seated at a long oval table of polished walnut, the grain reflecting the recessed ceiling lights like a topographical map of a financial empire. The museum rep, Dr. Skiff, was a woman about my age with silver spectacles and a quiet, observing manner. She shook my hand and held it for a beat longer than necessary, and I knew she had been fully briefed. The bank officer, a young man named Chris with a razor-sharp side part, and a fountain pen that he uncapped with a flourish, began reading the closing instructions from a leather-bound binder supplied by the museum's legal department. A stack of documents sat in the center of the table, including the fake dissolution with my forged signature, its pages neatly arranged in a presentation folder. When Chris got to the line that said, "Ms. Calloway, as the selling partner you are here to ratify the dissolution and transfer all rights to the collection to Mr. Gerald Calloway, who will then convey the collection to the museum." I raised my hand like a schoolchild who had finally been called on. "You wanted a signature, Gerald," I said, and my voice was as steady as a micrometer ratchet. "But the only thing I'll sign today is a witness statement for the FBI." Gerald's face went slack in stages, first the mouth, then the eyes, then the careful furrow between his brows that he'd probably practiced. Patricia dropped her museum donor pin, and it pinged off the edge of the table and rolled under a chair. The conference door opened, and 2 agents in plain suits walked in with the unhurried confidence of people who have done this many times before. Accompanied by Elena Marchetti, carrying her thermos like it was the gavel of justice. They placed Gerald and Patricia under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, forgery, identity theft, falsification of a federal tax form, and attempted theft of cultural property. The entire arrest took 90 seconds of quiet, almost anticlimactic procedure. Gerald kept repeating, "She's confused, she's grieving, you can't listen to her, she's been medicated," until one of the agents pulled a printout of the forged notary seal from his jacket, held it up beside a genuine sample Elena had obtained from the state's notary database, and recited the dead notary's date of death, which predated the forged signature by 2 years. Patricia started to cry, a shrill, hiccuping sound that reminded me of a pressure relief valve failing. The aftermath was a 12-month legal process that I documented in a binder thicker than any service manual I've ever assembled, a 3-ring archive of motions, depositions, certified mail receipts, and forensic accounting exhibits that I keep on a shelf in my shop next to the parts catalogues. Gerald was convicted on 3 felony counts of fraud and 1 count of conspiracy. But Patricia, facing a much longer sentence as an accessory, agreed to a plea deal that required her to testify against Gerald in the related civil case and to provide a full accounting of their financial schemes, which turned out to include credit card fraud against 3 other relatives and a fraudulent lien against a neighbor's vacation home. The civil suit, filed by me with Elena's forensic accounting as the backbone, resulted in a judgment of $578,000 in actual and punitive damages, a figure the court calculated based on the museum's bid, the interest I had lost on the insurance principal, the cost of repairing the damage Gerald had done when he broke into my safe and tried to crowbar open a locked cabinet containing the rarest cylinders, and the emotional distress of the entire ordeal. He had no liquid assets to pay the judgment, and Patricia's house was so heavily leveraged that foreclosure would have returned pennies. So the judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Halpern, who had read the entire evidence file, and who, it turned out, had a grandfather who collected gramophones, approved an unusual restitution arrangement at my explicit request. Gerald would work off the debt through supervised labor at my new business. The terms were specific, typed into the court order with the same precision I used to set a feed screw on a cylinder shaver. He would report to my shop 5 days a week, from 8 in the morning to 6 at night, and perform all tasks assigned by me, including polishing brass horns, stripping old shellac from cabinet oak using citrus solvent and a bronze brush, sweeping the floor with a push broom, organizing inventory in alphabetic order, and cleaning the bathroom with the industrial-grade vinegar solution I specified. He would wear a uniform polo shirt, charcoal grey, with the words "Cranked Up Lies" embroidered on the left chest in Columbia blue thread, in a font I selected from the embroiderer's catalogue, a sans serif block that reads clearly from across a room. He would be paid minimum wage, 80% of which would be garnished directly toward the judgment, leaving him with just enough to cover bus fare and a bagged lunch. He would not be permitted to speak to customers, touch any cylinder, handle any stylus, or represent himself as a partner, an owner, or an employee in any capacity beyond court-ordered laborer. The violation of any term would result in immediate revocation of his work release and a return to the remainder of his 4-year prison sentence. Patricia was ordered to attend 60 hours of financial ethics counseling and to stay at least 500 feet from my shop and my home, a radius she keeps with a GPS ankle monitor that I had the satisfaction of seeing her attach in court. I renamed the business Cylinder of Deceit Phonographs and registered it as an LLC with the state recovery docket stamped directly into the operating agreement, the docket number now part of our legal identity, like a brand on a shipping crate. The shop is in a restored 1920s storefront on Main Street, a building that used to be a haberdashery, with a pressed tin ceiling I had recoded in ivory enamel, and a front window display that features the original Victor horn, the one that started it all, now mounted on a Type E cabinet I restored using tiger-striped mahogany veneer and a French polish technique that takes 8 weeks. The horn sits under a glass case with a brass plaque that reads, "This horn concealed the truth. Let it amplify yours." Every restoration we complete includes a tag printed from a thermal label machine I programmed myself, a zebra printer that spits out little adhesive labels with a preset text line in monospace font, authenticity verified, fraud case no, 2023 CF 00874. When customers ask what that number means, my staff tells them the short version. The longer version is framed on the wall next to the restroom, a 12-page summary of the case with redacted names, and a timeline that ends with Gerald's work release start date. I have had exactly one customer complain that the docket number spoils the vintage aesthetic, and I told them with genuine cheer that they were welcome to remove the tag once they got home, but I would not sell a machine without it. They bought the machine anyway. Gerald has been polishing horns for 11 months now. He arrives at 7:55 a.m., punches a time clock I installed by the rear door, and changes into his cranked-up Lies shirt in the utility closet, which I keep unheeded in winter as a matter of personal principle. He has developed a servile posture I never saw in him before, shoulders rounded, eyes down, wrists moving in little mechanical circles as he buffs the bell of an Edison Morning Glory, or a Pathé concert horn with jeweler's rouge and a microfiber cloth, his reflection distorted in the brass like a funhouse mirror of his old bluster. He is not allowed to listen to music while he works, a condition I added after he attempted to play a podcast through earbuds, and the silence of the shop is filled with the faint hiss of the degreaser tank, the rhythmic tick of a spring motor being wound for stress testing, and the occasional scrubbing sound of his cloth on the metal. Last Sunday, I invited my granddaughters, Elena and Maeve, to the shop for a concert. We set up the Amberola 30 on a lace doily my mother had crocheted, its oak case glowing under a warm LED bulb I had selected for its low blue light content to emulate a carbon filament lamp, and I threaded a freshly shaved cylinder of Ada Jones singing "Come Josephine" in my flying machine onto the mandrel. The machine's governor clicked in, the stylus dropped into the groove, and that bright, warbling soprano, recorded in 1911 by a woman who had been dead for 70 years, filled the room with a sound so immediate and intimate that Elena, aged 9, stopped colouring and stared at the horn as if she expected a tiny woman to climb out of it. Maeve, aged 6, danced a little shuffle step in front of the speaker grill, and at the back of the shop, behind the parts bins and the rack of restored horns, Gerald sat on a stool with a rag and a can of Brasso, polishing a Morning Glory bell I'd assigned him that morning, his head bowed, his ears open, and I let him listen, because the clause about Sunday concerts was still in the original contract, and I am, if nothing else, a woman who honours her agreements. Daniel's warning was right on both counts. The document was my shield, and Gerald did show his colours, and the shield held because Daniel built it with meticulous care, not as a weapon, but as a calibration check against a systematic error he had seen coming from miles away. I think about that every morning when I unlock the shop, hear the hum of the shaver's feed screw, and see the fraud docket number scrolling off the label printer in crisp black lines. Integrity isn't something you can fake, not with a notary stamp, not with a forged signature, and not with a pocket square. It's a groove you cut into your own character by showing up over and over with a steady hand and a respect for the truth of the material in front of you. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? I want to hear your stories. If you believe the truth always finds a way to echo back, just like a century-old recording spinning faithfully on a calibrated mandrel, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. I'll see you in the next one.